Hello and welcome everybody to According to Andrew number 73, review of the origins of the Second World War. This is by AJP Taylor, as you can see on the screen, and I think it's an interesting book that has some interesting lessons for us to learn about in the modern times, and also some interesting takeaways, a unique perspective on the whole thing. Uh, and I wanted to kind of go through it and share my thoughts with you guys on the whole thing. So a lot of the setup for why the whole thing failed was that the Treaty of Versailles and stuff like that wasn't a fair treaty, and there's for why World War II happened, and there's a little bit of that, um, but it's not nearly as big of a player as one might think. And so I found that very interesting about the book. So we'll kind of go through it. I think there will be plenty of details for you to read later, but I will give you a good sense of kind of some of the conclusions of the book and things of that nature. Due to it being a nonfiction book, I don't feel like there's spoilers necessary in this one. Uh, I guess if that's a problem for you, click off the video. Um, anyway, let's get this rolling. So, uh, there, the historian, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on his name. Not Martin Van Creveld, but the conservative historian guy. Hold up. He does. Anyway, he does a lot of history and stuff like that on World War II and Greek and Roman. Victor David Hansen, that's his name. So, Victor David Hansen has talked about this topic and stuff like that, and there's some stuff that he says that kind of agrees with in this book, and I think ties into this book pretty well. And so I found that interesting. Also, a very interesting point when you're reading this book is some of the perspectives and various things like that. This book was written in 1961, which is kind of an interesting time period for this to be written because it is very um, counter narrative, at least today, and it probably was at the time. And he makes a good point of when you think about World War One, most people don't consider the actual war and what happened during the war. They talk about all the lead up to the war and all like the treaties and all that stuff. And the flip is the case in World War II. You talk about the war itself, all the interesting dynamics and stuff like that during the war, the technological race during the war and all that stuff, and you don't talk about what led up to the war, what caused the war, mainly because most people just are like, well, Hitler's a bad guy, so Hitler or the war happened, and he does a good job of arguing why that isn't necessarily. I mean, it's not like Hitler had zero influence. Obviously, he did, um, but the things that kind of led up to that becoming the case. So, uh, kind of the situation that he sets up is this interesting kind of Thucydides trap. So, uh, going back to Victor David Hansen, he's got this quote that I heard during one of his speeches that I listened to, um, that only nations that are unsure as to which side will actually win the war are ones that go to war. So, if you have like Russia versus Bulgaria, let's say, it's and it's nation versus nation. It's pretty obvious which of those nations are going to win, and therefore there generally isn't any fighting, and Bulgaria will effectively fall under the influence of the Russian state. So that's kind of what we saw with the Soviet Union, right? There was a lot, Poland and Czechoslovakia, and I think Bulgaria was in there, and all the Baltic states and stuff like that. Half of Germany were under the influence of the Soviet Union because none of those nations were strong enough, even if they united, probably to defeat the Soviet Union, and so they kind of adopted their point of view and a lot of their culture and things like that. Uh, and so this is where like you have great powers and you have their spheres of influence. It's kind of weird today because America's kind of the only great power, and so they're kind of forcing their sphere of influence over everybody, or at least trying to. It is and it isn't working. Fourth generation warfare is kind of throwing off this idea, but um, all that aside, this is how things worked back then. um, and so you have this interesting dynamic in Europe where uh, Germany loses World War One, but uh, all of the basically the winners of World War One all have imposter syndrome, except for the United States. Uh, and right, okay, so the two Western powers, Britain and France, have imposter syndrome because they didn't win the war, and they literally couldn't have won the war um, if America hadn't stepped in and basically beat the Germans for them. Uh, and Russia was beaten by the uh, Germans, so they don't really have an issue on imposter syndrome there because there's no question as to who won the war on that side. Um, so because of this, and because America just basically came over, slapped some people up, and then disappeared again, the question of who was the great power of Europe actually didn't get answered in World War One, which caused a massive, massive issue with the power dynamic in Europe. And this power dynamic uh, came down to the fact that at some point Germany was going to be rearmed, and they were going to be. You couldn't just keep Germany unarmed forever, and if they weren't, people like Chamberlain and stuff like that weren't conciliatory and kind of being like, look, you're gonna get rearmed, everything will be fine, and try to kind of bring them back into the fold. And while this strategy didn't work and it has its faults, there's a certain logic and reason for them to doing that, and I think he does a good job of of laying out. Um, it's like no, they weren't just dumb. Like they knew the situation they were in, and it wasn't to their favor. And the events of World War II kind of played that out because guess what? Big Daddy America had to come in and save the frickin' day again. um, there's a chance that they would have lost to Russia, but that's another part of the equation that we'll get into a little bit later. Um, so Britain and Russia basically know if Germany's rearmed again and they don't have America to back them up, they can't win a war against Germany. And therefore, Germany is actually the supreme power of Europe. They're the great power of Europe. But because of how World War One played out, it's acted like they uh, aren't the great power. And this is why Versailles seems like a bad treaty because again going back to a Victor David Hanson thing, it's not that the Versailles Treaty was extra more punitive or mean spirited than any other treaty that was uh, in existence before. It's that it wasn't an enforced treaty and therefore it caused this friction and stuff like that. And he's right on that. But another aspect to that is it couldn't be enforced because of the because despite their posturing and the fact that they won the last war, France and Britain were no longer the supreme powers of Europe. It was still Germany and maybe Russia, and that's the question mark that I'll get to a little bit later. Because Russia, well, I'll just talk about it now. Because Russia uh, lost in World War One, but is now the Soviet Union and has had a lot of restructuring and these other things, and a lot of people think they're a joke. And to be fair, with what they've seen from the outside, there's a reason to think they're a joke. Uh, there is a question mark that leads to that other question that Victor David Hansen had posed, which was nations that are unsure of each other will go to war to see which one is actually strongest. And so there was a question there between Germany and Russia as to who was the strongest because you had this new um, governing system and a war against the premier power of Europe would be a good way to kind of test their mettle. Now, they were kind of excluded from Europe just because of the buffer state situation that they're in, because Germany and Russia used to share a border, and so Germany and Russia or Germany basically had Russia and France right on their doorstep, and that kind of dynamic changed where Russia felt excluded from European politics because they had to basically go through states like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Ukraine and stuff like that to get to uh, um, get to places like Germany and stuff like. And so they couldn't ever directly attack Germany, which was good for the Germans, but it kind of put a lot of weird and put a lot of diplomatic discussions in a bind when it came to protecting France's ability to protect eastern places along with Britain and and Russia's ability to, because they'd effectively have to march all the way through uh, the territory of the place that they're trying to protect, just so they could get to the front line of the actual war. So, with all that out of the way, uh, basically, World War One was this Thucydides trap where basically the rising power is intersecting the declining power, which is Germany, comes and intersects France and Britain. And if that had naturally been able to play out, Germany would have become the premier power of Europe, and everything else would have been fine. But then they had this weird situation, which doesn't usually happen, which is a great power from another region basically comes in and tips the balance over there, but then leaves and therefore doesn't actually answer the question, because the question was, who is the strongest in Europe? And the answer was, well, if things keep playing out this one, but if this other third party comes in at any given time for whatever random reason, then it's and choose basically needs to pick the winner, then it's that person. And so you end up with this weird situation. So I think if World War One had played out how if America doesn't get involved and World War One plays out, this is what you have happen. So because Russia was actually defeated in World War One, the new communist government would have to prove its power on the world stage. If World War One had been won by the Germans, the fight would have been the World War Two era major wars for who is the supreme powers in the world and in their respective zones of influence would be between in Europe, Russia and Germany for dominance of Europe. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, you had the U.S. and Japan fighting for dominance of the world's oceans. So those would be probably the two major conflicts in the 40s that would happen, and they'd be separate wars. It wouldn't be a world war where both of them are area connected. They would probably be separate wars. Then what would potentially happen after that is either like a Cold War situation where, so if Russia comes out on top and America, let's say just Russia and America win again. So Russia comes out on top in Europe, America comes out on top in the Japan fight. Now there's kind of like a struggle of like, okay, well now for world dominance, which one of us is the strongest? And so maybe you have a Cold War situation develop again, or you have a major conflict between those, and maybe that drags the rest of the world into the conflict as well. Maybe not. Maybe they just kind of stay out of the thing because it'd be a little bit of a China, well, not exactly, but it would be actually a good analogy of this would be the Britain-France dynamic back in the Napoleonic era, because you'd have Russia. So back then, basically, France was the dominant power of the land, but they had no naval power, and Britain was the dominant naval power, but they had no land power. America and Russia dynamic would be the same. Russia would be the dominant land power in the Eurasian landmass, and America would be the dominant world power in terms of its naval capabilities and what it can and its influence on global sea trade. And so, like, those are kind of like the spheres of influence they would probably control and have influence over. And they could probably just kind of get along fine that way. So I find it interesting that you kind of have this dynamic where, you know, you have fights break out in the World War II era, but not in the same way that you would think when World War I plays out the way it does. And there's a lot of other factors that go into that, obviously, but that's kind of what happens. So just to give you a sense of the book a little bit more, so France and Britain are in this bind because they know they can't enforce it. They wrote this treaty against Germany, and because they needed America to win the war, they need America to be able to enforce the treaty. Well, America has no interest in enforcing that treaty. They've retreated back to back to the United States, where they're fine being isolationist again and doing their thing, especially with the downturn in the economy with the Great Depression. So France and Britain have no way of enforcing this treaty. So because they have no way of enforcing the treaty, and they don't really want to go to war because they know they're going to lose a war if it's just them, they do everything they can to try to appease Germany. But the matter of the fact is, when you're in a negotiation situation and you know you hold all the cards, you don't negotiate. You just make demands, and then you get those demands, and then you make more demands, and that's what Germany did. That's what Hitler did. He's like, well, I don't have to give up anything, and you're just giving me everything on a silver platter, so I'm just gonna keep doing that, and that's effectively what happened. Obviously, a lot that played into that is Hitler's notorious gambling addiction. Maybe would be a way. Basically, he would just bet the whole house every single time on some of these uh, situations, and eventually it blows up in Danzig, where he actually gets the whole world to kind of go to war, and that's because somebody played him against, or played his own game against him, which was Poland, which kind of backfired on them, but it didn't. It didn't. So uh, Poland basically realized, even if it's a losing situation, if we don't stand our ground here, we lose everything with no fight, and there's no like I. What's the point of getting rid of uh, just giving them basically your all of your chips without ever even playing? So they decided, you know what? All I have to do is not negotiate and force certain people into these contracts that they don't want to be in, and from there, we'll get people like Britain and France and stuff like that, and maybe even Russia involved in this overall war. Obviously, Russia and Germany signed the uh, something Ribbentrop Pact, where it was basically the non-aggression pact, and but because they didn't bend, they didn't uh, give any uh, thing for them. It put Germany in a bind where they've been able to always feign that they weren't the aggressors, which wasn't true. But at the same time, they could be like, look, like Czechoslovakia, they would constantly make appeals to nationality, and people do this all the time with basically everything. It's like you're kind of like looking for an excuse to expand, kind of thing. Uh, how much of that is like how much was nationalism used as an excuse to expand, and how much of it was actually trying to get all of the German people back into the fold of Germany again? Probably we'll never truly know, but there's obviously some text and stuff that is from Hitler that kind of points to ever expanding uh, policy, but also he's been known to say inflammatory things to try to, you you ask for twice as much as you want, and you use inflammatory language and rhetoric to get people to make uh, uh, concessions, basically saying, I want $1 billion. You're like, $1 billion? That's ridiculous. And, like the person was willing to pay you like 1,000, and you're like, I'll give you 100,000. You're like, fine. And it's like 100,000 is what you actually wanted, right? It's the classic um, haggling that you do with certain cultures, like Mexico and Israel and Middle Eastern cultures and places like that. So yeah, you got that kind of situation, and it's just kind of interesting that a lot of the seeds that were planted in World War One for World War Two was the Versailles Treaty, but to me it almost seems like the bigger seeds that were planted weren't necessarily the um wasn't the Versailles Treaty so much as it was the inability for Britain and France, without the support of America, to enforce those treaties. Now, maybe if America had stayed involved, something else could have worked out in Europe that would have been fine. Hard to know what that would look like, but maybe that'll be an interesting uh, alternate history for another day. But that pretty much wraps up my thoughts on that. Hopefully, you guys find that interesting. Definitely recommend this book. It's a very different and unique take to the Second World War. It's not just Hitler bad, and it's also kind of interesting that this guy was able to have such a removed perspective from the overall events, considering it was only 20 years afterwards, and and the amount of rhetoric and stuff like that surrounding World War II is probably higher than most. Uh, I mean, just taking 9/11 today, and uh, sure, there's people that will go against like the narrative of 9/11 stuff like that, but there's not too many, and that's kind of and I know a lot of people will recoil from you for doing so. So you got to imagine that a similar aspect is going on with this book, and so I think it's interesting. If you're interested in World War II history, I think it's definitely worth a read, and I think it might give you a new and interesting perspective on the overall conflict and how it got started. So that kind of covers my stuff. Thank you guys for listening. This has been According to Andrew, and I hope you guys have a good day. Goodbye.